The air in the house was thick with ghosts and the smell of lemony cleaning spray, a desperate, final attempt to erase their existence. Ilara Vance ran a hand over the bare dining table, the polished wood still holding the faint warmth of a life that was no longer hers. She felt a familiar ache bloom in her chest, a tight, suffocating grief for her husband, Daniel, whose laughter used to echo off these now silent walls. The foreclosure notice, a crisp, cruel piece of paper, lay on the counter, its black ink a final judgment. Her stomach churned, not from hunger, though that was a gnawing companion, but from the nauseating vertigo of loss. Every creak of the floorboards was a whisper of a memory. Leo taking his first steps, Daniel carrying her over the threshold. Now the house was just a hollow shell, stripped of photos, of books, of life. She could almost hear the low hum of the hospital machines that had devoured their savings, the beeps that had counted down the last moments of their security, a soundtrack to their slow-motion collapse into destitution. The silence was the loudest sound of all. Outside, a cold coastal wind whipped around the corners of their old station wagon, rattling the frame. The car was packed to the roof with the haphazard artifacts of their life, cardboard boxes sealed with cracking tape, black trash bags bulging with clothes, Leo's guitar case wedged precariously beside his father's old fishing tackle box. Her son, Leo, just 17, stood with his shoulders hunched against the wind and the world, his face a mask of teenage stoicism that couldn't quite hide the fear in his eyes. Ilara felt a wave of shame wash over her, so cold and sharp it made her gasp. She had failed him. She, the librarian who had always found an answer in a book, had no solution for this. She clutched the car keys in her hand, the metal biting into her palm, one last look at the peeling blue paint of the front door, one last breath of the salt-laced air that had defined their years here. Then, the sound of the engine turning over, a rough, protesting cough that was the sound of their future. Homeless. The word was a stone in her throat, choking her. The car's glove compartment held their entire net worth. Ilara's trembling fingers pulled out the thin stack of bills, held together by a paperclip. She counted them again, a pointless ritual of confirmation. A 50, 7 20s, 3 10s, 5 1s, exactly $280. The paper felt flimsy, almost unreal, a pathetic shield against the vast, unforgiving world waiting outside the car windows. Beside the cash was the final, monstrous medical bill for Daniel's illness, a sum so astronomical it felt like a joke from a cruel god. It had taken everything. Their savings, their home, their dignity. A sharp pang of hunger shot through her, so intense it made her dizzy. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, saving the last of the bread and peanut butter for Leo. His quiet, "I'm okay, Mom," was a lie they both pretended to believe. She felt the tears welling up, hot and acidic, but she forced them back down. A librarian without a library, a widow without a home, a mother without a plan. The weight was a physical pressure crushing her chest. She drove for an hour with no destination, the fuel gauge needle creeping steadily toward empty. Finally, she pulled into the desolate parking lot of a closed-down diner, its neon sign a skeleton of unlit glass tubes. She killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind and the soft, rhythmic tap of a loose wire against the windshield. They were an island in a sea of asphalt, marooned. Leo stared out his window, his breath fogging the glass, his reflection a pale ghost. Ilara followed his gaze to the darkening horizon, a bruised smudge of purple and grey. The cold was starting to seep through the car's thin metal shell, a damp chill that settled deep in her bones. "Mom?" Leo's voice was small, cracking the silence. "What are we going to do?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. A wave of pure, undiluted terror seized Ilara. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. They had nowhere to go, no one to call. The night was falling, and they were utterly, terrifyingly alone. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, she could smell the sea on Daniel's coat, a briny, comforting scent that meant he was home safe. She remembered his calloused hands, strong and sure, holding hers. He had been their anchor. Now she was adrift in a storm with no land in sight, her son the only other passenger on their sinking vessel. This car, filled with the ghosts of their possessions, felt less like a vehicle and more like a tomb, for a life that ended when the eviction notice was posted. The steering wheel was cold and unyielding beneath her grip. In front of them, the road was a ribbon of blackness disappearing into nothing. Was this it? Was this the end of their story? Despair was a physical entity, a passenger in the back seat, its cold breath on her neck, threatening to extinguish the last flicker of hope. What would you do in her place, with everything lost and nowhere left to turn? If you want to find out what happens to Ilara and Leo, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible story. 3 days later, a call from an unknown number split the oppressive silence in the car. Ilara's phone, plugged into the cigarette lighter, flickered to life with its last ounces of power. Her heart seized with a familiar dread, expecting a debt collector's automated voice. Instead, a crisp, professional tone introduced himself as a Mr. Abernathy, a solicitor from a distant coastal town. He spoke of a will, of a distant relative of Daniel's she'd never even heard of, a great-uncle named Alistair Vance. The words flowed past her in a detached, legalistic stream, but 3 of them snagged in her mind, pulling her from her days. Inheritance, property, lighthouse, a beat of silence. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, explaining it was a decommissioned lighthouse and keeper's cottage on a place called St. Jude's Rock, a rock named for the patron saint of lost causes. A bitter, hysterical laugh almost escaped Ilara's lips. It wasn't a fortune, he warned, but it was property, a roof, a home. For the first time in weeks, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited in the cold darkness of her chest. Leo, sensing the shift in her posture, looked over, his brow furrowed with cautious curiosity. Ilara relayed the information in a hushed, trembling voice, the words feeling foreign and unbelievable on her tongue. A lighthouse, their own lighthouse. The image it conjured was romantic, fantastical. A tall, white tower standing sentinel against the sea, a cozy cottage tucked at its base. It was a fairy tale, a deus ex machina swooping in to save them from the grim reality of their station wagon. Leo's skepticism was a shield. A lighthouse? Mom? For real? What's the catch? He asked, his voice low. Ilara felt a surge of desperate optimism, a force she hadn't felt since before Daniel got sick. There is no catch, Leo. It's ours. It has to be better than this. She clung to the idea with the ferocious grip of a drowning woman. This wasn't just a chance, it was a sign. A signal from the universe, from Daniel, that they weren't meant to disappear. It was their last and only refuge, a beacon calling them home. The decision solidified in her mind, heavy and absolute. They spent the last of their $280 chartering a small and weathered fishing boat named the Sea Serpent. The captain was a man named Silas, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and sea, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. He counted the cash with a calloused thumb, his expression unreadable. St. Jude's Rock. Ain't been a soul living out there in 40 years, he grunted, the sound of his voice like stones grinding together. You sure about this, Mum? Ilara's nod was firm, betraying none of the terror that was beginning to coil in her stomach. The exchange of money felt like a momentous transaction, a final severing of ties with their old life. As they loaded their pathetic collection of bags and boxes onto the rocking vessel, a profound sense of finality washed over her. There was no going back. The diesel engine sputtered to life with a cough of black smoke, and the boat pulled away from the dock, leaving the mainland and any semblance of safety to shrink behind them. A cold, salty spray misted Ilara's face, mingling with tears she refused to let fall. The journey took over an hour, a churning, nauseating trek across a slate-grey sea under an indifferent sky. The constant thrum of the engine vibrated through the hull, a monotonous rhythm that seemed to work its way into Ilara's very bones. She and Leo huddled together for warmth, the wind a relentless thief, stealing the heat from their bodies. Leo was silent, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of water, his face pale. Ilara felt a pang of guilt, sharp as a knife. What was she dragging him into? The hope that had burned so brightly on the phone was now a flickering candle flame, threatened by the vast, cold reality of the ocean. She tried to focus on the image of the stoic, white lighthouse, a symbol of strength and endurance. It had to be okay. It just had to be. The farther they traveled from shore, the more the isolation pressed in on them, They were a tiny, insignificant speck in a world of water and sky, heading towards a future that was entirely unknown, a gamble made with the last vestiges of their life. Then, a shape emerged from the misty horizon. At first, it was just a faint vertical smudge against the grey, but as the sea serpent chugged closer, it resolved into the form of St. Jude's Rock and its lighthouse. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. From a distance, it almost matched her fantasy, a tall, slender tower of stone, defiant against the waves crashing at its base. But the closer they got, the more the fantasy began to crumble, the beautiful image dissolving pixel by pixel into a harsh, ugly truth. The white paint was almost entirely gone, peeled away by decades of salt and wind, to reveal mottled, leprous patches of grey stone beneath. The magnificent lantern room at the top was a cage of broken glass and rusted metal. A sense of dread, cold and heavy, began to settle in Ilara's stomach. This was not a beacon of hope. This was a skeleton. The captain cut the engine, and the sudden silence was filled with the roar of the surf and the mournful cries of gulls. Her heart sank like a stone. Silas dropped anchor 100 feet from the shore, the churning water too treacherous and shallow to get any closer. "This is as far as I go," he announced, his voice flat. "The tide's turning. I can't wait." The reality of their situation hit Ilara with the force of a physical blow. They had to wade. Leo, without a word, swung his legs over the side, his sneakers and jeans instantly soaked by the shockingly cold water. He grimaced, but began hauling their bags towards the sliver of black, stony beach. Ilara followed, the icy brine biting at her skin, a cruel welcome to her new home. Each step was a struggle, her feet sinking into the shifting gravel and slipping on seaweed-slicked rocks. The weight of her own bag felt immense, a burden of all her terrible decisions. By the time they reached the shore, they were soaked, shivering, and utterly exhausted. Silas was already turning the boat around, a small dark shape receding into the vastness, leaving them marooned. They were completely and utterly alone. The lighthouse tower loomed over them, a crumbling giant that seemed to watch them with malevolent indifference. But it was the attached keeper's cottage that truly stole Ilara's breath away. Ruin was too gentle a word. It was a carcass. A large section of the roof had caved in entirely, leaving the interior exposed to the elements like a gaping wound. The windows were not just shattered. The frames themselves were rotted out, dark, vacant eyes in a decaying face. The front door hung from a single, grotesquely twisted hinge, banging rhythmically in the wind, a sound like a slow, steady, mocking applause. A wave of nausea rose in Ilara's throat. This was worse than the car, worse than a shelter. This was a place that nature had reclaimed, a place where humans were no longer welcome. She had spent their last dollar to bring her son to a pile of garbage on a rock in the middle of nowhere. The hope she had harbored was not just false, it was a cruel, vicious joke, and the punchline was this scene of absolute desolation. Hesitantly, Ilara pushed the broken door. The screech of the last hinge was a sound of protest, of agony. The stench that rolled out to meet them was overwhelming. A physical assault on the senses. It was a thick, gagging combination of stagnant water, pungent mold, and the unmistakable, sweetish rot of something long dead. The air inside was heavy and damp, clinging to their skin and clothes. The floor was a treacherous landscape of rubble from the collapsed roof, splintered wood and soggy, blackened debris. A tattered armchair, its stuffing bursting out like entrails, sat in one corner, covered in a verdant fuzz of green mold. Water stains streaked the remaining walls like long, sorrowful tears. Everything was coated in a fine, gritty layer of salt and dust. A sudden scuttling sound from within the walls made Ilara jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. Rats. Of course, there were rats. This wasn't a home. It was a tomb, and they had just walked into it. The full weight of her failure crashed down on her. Leo dropped his bag with a wet thud, the sound shockingly loud in the eerie quiet. He stared around the wreckage, his face a mask of disbelief that was slowly hardening into despair. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence was more damning than any accusation. Ilara could feel his trust in her, already so fragile, shattering into a million pieces. She had promised him a roof over their heads, and she had delivered this. A dangerous, stinking, collapsing shell. She walked further into the main room, her feet crunching on broken glass. In what might have been a kitchen, a rusted iron stove was tilted at a drunken angle, its pipe disconnected and hanging from the ceiling like a metal vine. The sink was filled with black, slimy rainwater. There was no electricity, no running water, just the endless, mournful symphony of the wind whistling through 1,000 cracks and the relentless crash of waves against the rock. The isolation was no longer a feeling, it was a physical wall, pressing in on them from all sides. She ran a hand over a damp, peeling wall, and her fingers came away slick with grime. A bone-deep weariness settled over her, so profound it made her knees feel weak. The brief, manic energy of hope had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow ache that was worse than the initial despair. Before they were adrift, but on a road that could, theoretically, lead somewhere. Now they were trapped. Stuck on this godforsaken rock with no money, no communication and no way to leave. The captain had said he made a supply run to the outer islands once a month. A month? Could they even survive a month here? A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, racked her body. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, grotesque shadows across the ruined room. The approaching darkness felt predatory, a tangible entity waiting to swallow them whole. This wasn't the bottom. She had been wrong. This was a new, deeper level of hell, one she had personally purchased for them. The sound of a single, choked sob broke the silence. It was Leo. He had his back to her, his shoulders shaking. Ilara's heart broke. She had tried so hard to be strong for him, to shield him from the worst of their collapse, but she had failed spectacularly. She had led him from a warm house full of memories to a cold car, and from the car to this flooded, rotting mausoleum. She wanted to go to him, to wrap her arms around him, but her feet felt bolted to the floor. What could she possibly say? What hollow comfort could she offer? The words, "I'm sorry," felt pathetic, insulting. The weight of her guilt was a physical thing, a crushing pressure on her chest that made it hard to breathe. She had gambled their last shred of security on a fairy tale, and they had lost everything. The lighthouse wasn't a beacon. It was a headstone for their hope. As the last light of day bled from the sky, a profound and terrifying certainty settled upon her. They had made a terrible mistake. The cold was becoming unbearable as night fell completely, plunging the ruin into an almost total darkness. The only light came from the moon, a pale, sickly glow filtering through the hole in the roof and the shattered windows. Every sound was magnified, the ceaseless roar of the ocean, the skittering of unseen creatures in the walls, the steady, maddening drip of water somewhere in the shadows. It sounded like the house was breathing, sighing, and weeping all around them. Ilara and Leo huddled together on the least damp section of the floor, wrapped in their coats, sharing a stale granola bar from Ilara's purse. The meager food did nothing to quell the gnawing hunger or the chill that had settled deep in their bones. Ilara felt a tremor run through Leo and pulled him closer, her own body shivering uncontrollably. The dream of a safe harbor had become a nightmare of entrapment. Here their poverty was starker, their isolation more absolute, their future more terrifyingly blank than it had ever been. She stared out a broken window at the churning black water, illuminated by slivers of moonlight. The waves crashed against the rocks with a violent, percussive force, each one a reminder of their imprisonment. The sea wasn't a beautiful expanse, it was a cage. The salt spray felt like grit on her skin, in her hair, on her lips. She could taste their despair. It tasted like brine and rust. The romantic notion of a lighthouse keeper, a solitary, noble figure, now seemed like a cruel mockery. There was nothing noble about this. This was a slow, cold, damp decay. This was being forgotten by the world. The hope that had carried them across the water was now just another ghost haunting this desolate place, a phantom of what might have been. A silent tear finally escaped, tracing a cold path down her cheek. She had thought they had hit rock bottom in that diner parking lot, but she had been naive. She had used a shovel and dug them deeper. A powerful gust of wind slammed against the cottage, rattling the entire structure. A loose piece of timber from the broken roof clattered down somewhere inside, making both of them flinch violently. Ilara's body was coiled tight with tension, every nerve ending screaming. This place felt actively hostile, as if the island itself was trying to reject them, to grind them down and wash them away with the tide. She thought of the $280, now in the pocket of the boat captain, a fortune that could have bought them food and fuel for another week, a week of mobility, a week of possibility. She had traded it for this prison. The sheer stupidity of her decision was a weight that threatened to crush her spirit entirely. She closed her eyes, but there was no escape. The image of the crumbling walls, the stench of decay, the feeling of damp cold, it was all seared into her mind. This was their new reality, a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. Leo had fallen into a fitful, shivering sleep, his head resting on her shoulder. Elara stayed awake, a sentinel in the dark, her senses on high alert. The fear was a living thing beside her, its cold breath on her neck. It whispered of starvation, of sickness, of the slow, inevitable fade into nothing. How could they possibly survive here? The question circled in her mind, a vulture waiting for the last twitch of life to cease. She felt a deep, primal anger rise within her, anger at Daniel for dying, at the medical system for bankrupting them, at the world for its casual cruelty. But most of all, she felt a towering, suffocating anger at herself. She, the librarian, the keeper of stories, had led them to this desolate place where it felt like their own story was about to come to a grim, final end. There, in the ruins of a forgotten lighthouse, surrounded by darkness and the roar of an unforgiving sea, Elara Vance finally hit the bottom. Hope was dead. There was nothing left. The first few days on St. Jude's Rock were a blur of Sisyphean labor. Elara and Leo worked until their muscles screamed, their hands raw and blistered. They cleared a small section of the cottage's main room, dragging rubble and debris outside to form a grim, growing pile. They patched the most gaping holes in the wall with splintered planks and sodden bits of furniture, a pathetic defense against the relentless wind. The gnawing hunger was a constant companion, only briefly silenced by the meager, salty fish Leo managed to catch with his father's old rod. Each sunset was a prelude to another night of shivering in the damp, oppressive dark. The initial shock had numbed into a dull, grinding despair. They were survivors, but they were not living. They were simply existing, minute by minute, on an island that felt like the edge of the world, their hope eroding with every tide that washed against the black, unforgiving stones of their prison. This was not a life, but a slow cold waiting for an end they couldn't yet imagine. On the third night, the sky, which had been a sheet of bruised purple, turned a malevolent, inky black. The wind, once a mournful sigh, began to howl, a rising, predatory scream that seemed to claw at the very foundations of the lighthouse. Rain began to fall, not as drops, but as hard, horizontal needles driven by the gale. It hammered against the stone tower and found every single crack in their makeshift repairs on the cottage. The sound was deafening, a chaotic symphony of nature's rage. The sea responded in kind, its roar escalating from a constant crash to a series of thunderous, explosive impacts that shook the entire rock. Elara felt the vibrations in her bones, a deep, terrifying tremor that seemed to signal the island's imminent destruction. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a frantic prayer. She felt a primal terror she had never known, the certainty that this crumbling ruin would not withstand the onslaught, that the ocean itself was rising to swallow them whole. The storm reached a fever pitch, a biblical tempest of sound and fury. A loud crack, like a rifle shot, echoed from above as a section of the remaining roof tore loose, sending a shower of rotted wood and slate crashing down into the far corner of the room. Elara and Leo flinched violently, huddled together under a heavy, mouldering tarpaulin they had found, their only shield. The wind screeched through the new opening, a physical force that stole their breath and plastered their damp clothes to their skin. Leo was trembling, not just from the cold, but from sheer terror. Elara held him tight, her own body rigid with fear, trying to project a calm she was nowhere near feeling. The feeling of being trapped was absolute. They were infinitesimally small, caught in the jaws of a monstrous, uncaring storm, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The world had been reduced to this single, vibrating point of chaos and darkness, and their survival felt like a statistical impossibility. In a brief, terrifying lull between the roar of the surf and the shriek of the wind, Ilara crawled to one of the shattered windows. She needed to see, to confront the monster that was trying to tear their world apart. The sea was a churning, black abyss, shot through with phosphorescent white as colossal waves crested and smashed against the rocks below, sending plumes of spray high into the air. It was a scene of terrifying, sublime violence. She was mesmerized, her fear momentarily replaced by awe. And then it happened. For 3 impossible seconds, the lantern room at the very top of the tower blazed to life. It wasn't a flicker. It was an intense, silent, blinding pulse of pure white light that cut through the storm like a divine judgment. It illuminated the maelstrom in stark, ghostly detail before plunging the world back into an even deeper, more profound darkness. Ilara froze, her mind unable to process what her eyes had just seen. The air crackled with the afterimage, a phantom of impossible light. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. Her heart, which had been pounding with fear, seemed to stop entirely, suspended in a moment of pure, unadulterated shock. The light had been utterly silent, devoid of the crackle of lightning or the hum of machinery. It was just there, and then it was gone. "Mom, what was that?" Leo's voice was a strained whisper, barely audible over the returning howl of the wind. He had seen it too. Ilara shook her head, unable to form words. She tried to force a logical explanation into her panicked mind, a freak lightning strike hitting the lens in a perfect, focused way, a reflection from some distant, unseen source. But the storm was a wall of blackness. There were no ships, no helicopters, nothing but the raging sea and the shrieking wind. The light hadn't come from outside. It had come from within the tower. It felt ancient, deliberate, a signal from a ghost. A cold dread, different from her fear of the storm, began to creep up her spine, a feeling that they were not alone on this rock. Her librarian's mind, a place of order and reason, rebelled against the supernatural. She began to catalogue the impossibilities, a desperate attempt to ground herself in reality. On their first day, driven by a need to understand the geography of their prison, she and Leo had climbed the tower. They had seen the lamproom firsthand. The massive Fresnel lens was a magnificent, delicate fossil, but its turning mechanism was a solid mass of rust and corrosion. The brass gears were seized. The drive belts rotted away. The giant kerosene lamp that once powered it was gone, leaving only a blackened, empty pedestal. There were no wires, no generator, no power source of any kind. The lighthouse was a dead thing, a hollow monument to a forgotten technology. The flash of light was not just improbable, it was a fundamental violation of the laws of physics as she understood them. The event replayed in her mind, the silent, brilliant, impossible pulse. The mystery of it was a new kind of fear, an intellectual terror that was almost worse than the physical. Leo, always trying to find a rational anchor, offered a suggestion. Maybe a ship, far out, and their searchlight hit the glass just right. He sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Ilara dismissed it with a shake of her head. No ship would be this close to the rocks in this storm, Leo. They'd be miles out at sea. Besides, the light hadn't felt like a beam hitting glass. It was too pure, too perfectly formed, as if the great lens itself had awakened for a single, incandescent breath. It felt like an emission, a broadcast from the heart of the tower. The memory of its impossible intensity was burned onto her retinas. It was clean, white, and absolute. It wasn't the scattered, chaotic energy of lightning. It was focused. It was purposeful. She felt an unsettling certainty that the light was a message, but she couldn't fathom the sender or the meaning. The enigma of it began to push aside the immediate terror of their physical situation, replacing it with a deep, consuming unease. A strange new emotion began to bubble up through the cold sludge of her despair. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in months, a sharp, insistent curiosity. The librarian in her, the seeker of answers and solver of puzzles, was stirring from a long dormancy. The light was a question mark hanging in the stormy darkness, a loose thread in the fabric of reality. For days, their world had been defined by a grim, monotonous cycle of survival, finding food, staying warm, keeping the sea out. It was a life of reaction, of being acted upon by hunger and cold. But this was different. This was a mystery, a phenomenon that defied explanation and demanded investigation. For the first time since stepping onto St. Jude's Rock, Elara felt a flicker of agency, a primal urge not just to survive, but to know. The puzzle of the ghost light was a hook that snagged in her mind, pulling her focus away from the hopelessness of their plight and toward the unknown. The compulsion became overwhelming. "I'm going up there," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the noise of the gale. Leo stared at her, his eyes wide with alarm. "Mom, no, are you crazy? The tower's not safe. Listen to the wind." He was right. It was a reckless, dangerous idea. The stone tower was likely slick with condensation, and the wind tearing through the broken lantern room at the top could easily hurl a person from the precipice. But the need to understand was a fire in her gut, burning away the cold fear. "I have to," she insisted, her gaze locked on the darkness where the tower door stood. "I have to see. I won't be able to rest until I know." It was an irrational drive, born from a place deeper than logic. In a world that had taken everything from her, this one impossible event was something she could seize, something she could investigate. It was a choice, and the simple act of making one felt like a reclamation of her own soul. The storm was a monster, but the mystery was a siren, and its call was stronger. She grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight they had salvaged from the car, its beam a weak but precious weapon against the suffocating dark. Leo's protests faded into the storm's roar as she pulled open the heavy wooden door at the base of the tower. The wind inside the spiral staircase was a focused, shrieking vortex, a vertical tunnel of sound that threatened to extinguish her light and her resolve. The steps were worn stone, concave from a century of keeper's boots, and coated in a treacherous film of damp, salty grime. The air was thick with the smell of wet stone and decay. She placed a hand on the cold iron railing. It was slick with moisture, and felt like it might crumble under her weight. Every upward step was a conscious act of will, a battle against the screaming wind, the oppressive darkness, and the tremor of fear that vibrated through her entire body. The circle of her flashlight beam danced nervously on the curving wall ahead, a tiny island of light in an ocean of blackness. The climb was an ascent into a nightmare. Her legs, weak from hunger and inactivity, burned with the effort. Her lungs ached as she gasped in the cold, damp air. The sound was the worst part. The wind didn't just howl around the tower. It played it like a malevolent instrument, creating deep, groaning moans and high-pitched whistles that echoed down the stairwell. It sounded like the cries of the dead. With every turn of the spiral, she felt a wave of vertigo, the terrifying sensation that the entire structure was swaying in the gale. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the icy railing. She forced herself not to look down into the swirling abyss of blackness below. She focused only on the next step, and the next her mind a mantra of "I have to see, I have to know." This was more than a climb. It was a pilgrimage toward an answer, a desperate, vertical struggle against the gravity of her own despair. The darkness felt physical, a heavy blanket she had to push through. Finally, her head emerged into the lantern room. The change in atmosphere was instantaneous and jarring. The focused funnel of wind from the stairwell exploded into a chaotic, 360-degree assault. The storm raged outside the cage of broken glass and rusted iron, and it felt as if she was standing at the very heart of it. The huge, multifaceted Fresnel lens stood before her, a silent, skeletal god in the center of the chaos. It was even more pathetic up close in the storm. Water dripped from its lifeless prisms, and the wind whistled through the cracks in its housing. Her flashlight beam caught on the shattered panes of the lantern windows, revealing a terrifying, dizzying panorama of the churning, black sea far below. She felt a primal fear of the height, a magnetic pull toward the jagged openings and the violent oblivion they promised. The air tasted of salt, rust, and the sharp electric smell of ozone, a phantom scent left by the ghost light. She forced her fear down and began the investigation, her movements stiff and cautious. She circled the massive lamp assembly, playing her flashlight beam over every inch of its structure. It was exactly as she remembered, a monument to decay. The intricate clockwork mechanism that was meant to rotate the lens was a single, fused piece of corroded brass and iron. She pushed on one of the gears with all her might. It didn't move a millimeter. It was without a doubt a dead machine. She ran her hand over the empty pedestal where the light source should have been. It was cold, grimy stone. There was no wiring, no fuel line, nothing. The impossibility of what she'd seen solidified from a suspicion into a cold, hard fact. The light had not come from this lamp. It was a ghost. A shiver racked her body. A cold that had nothing to do with the wind. The tower was holding a secret, and the light had been its voice. The mystery was no longer just a question, it was a presence. Her mind, denied a mechanical explanation, scrambled for another. If the light wasn't generated here, could the lens have focused something else? An aberrant form of lightning, perhaps St. Elmo's fire, amplified and directed by the prisms. It was a wild, desperate theory, but it was better than ghosts. She began to examine the room from that new perspective. Was there something that could have acted as a strange conductor or reflector? She swept the flashlight beam across the floor, the walls, the ceiling, searching for an anomaly. The floor was mostly stone, but the area directly around the lamp's base was covered in tarnished brass plating, likely to protect the floor from oil and heat in its operational days. It was dull, green with verdigris, and certainly not reflective enough to cause the brilliant flash she had witnessed. Her frustration grew. The answer was here. She could feel it, but the room was holding its silence, offering up no clues. As she slowly circled the base of the lamp for the third time, her foot slid on the slick floor. To steady herself, she planted her boot heavily, and it struck the brass plating with a dull, metallic clank. But one part of the sound was different. Not a clank, but a hollow thump. She froze. Dropping to her knees, heedless of the damp and grime, she ran her hands over the spot. Her fingers traced the seams in the plating until she found it. A perfect, circular plate, nearly 3 feet in diameter, set directly beneath the central axis of the lamp. And along one edge, the seam was wider. The plate was slightly, almost imperceptibly, raised. Her heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. This was it. This was the anomaly. It wasn't part of the original design she'd seen in old diagrams of lighthouses. It was an addition, something hidden in plain sight. Adrenaline surged through her, hot and electric, banishing the cold. Her numb fingers scraped at the edge of the brass plate, trying to find purchase. The gap was barely wide enough for her fingernails, which bent and broke against the stubborn metal. It wouldn't budge. It was sealed by time and corrosion. Panic and frustration warred within her. She was so close. She scanned the cluttered corners of the room, and her flashlight beam landed on a length of rusted iron bar, probably a broken piece of the window frame. It was heavy and sharp on one end, a perfect crowbar. With trembling hands, she jammed the sharp end of the bar into the thin gap. She put all of her weight on it, her muscles straining, a low groan escaping her lips. The bar bowed under the pressure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a high-pitched, agonizing screech of metal protesting its disturbance, the seal broke. With a final, grunting heave, the heavy brass plate lifted. It was far heavier than she had imagined, lined with a thick layer of lead that made it astonishingly dense. She levered it up and swung it to the side, where it crashed onto the stone floor with a deafening clang that was swallowed by the storm. She peered into the opening. It was not the solid stone foundation she expected to see. It was a void, a perfectly square, dark cavity cut directly into the floor of the tower. Her flashlight beam pierced the darkness, revealing that the small chamber was lined with the same dulled grey lead as the cover. It was a meticulously crafted hiding place, a secret compartment designed to be invisible and to shield its contents from the elements. A cold, dry air wafted up from the hole, an exhalation from the past. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her heart was hammering so loudly it felt like a physical impact in her chest. She knelt at the edge of the opening, her hand trembling as she aimed the flashlight into the recess. The beam fell upon a single object, nestled in the center of the lead-lined space. It was a rectangular box, its surface a dark, matte color. It looked military, functional, built for utility and endurance. A waterproof tin box. The sight of it sent a dizzying wave of vertigo through her. This was the sanctum. This was the heart of the secret. For 40 years, through countless storms just like this one, it had waited. It had waited for her. The ghost light had been a key, a summons, an invitation to this exact spot. Slowly, reverently, she reached into the cold, dark compartment. Her fingers brushed against the cool, smooth surface of the box. It felt solid, heavy with significance. She gripped it, her knuckles white. and lifted it from its tomb. She placed it on the brass plate beside her, the sound a low, resonant thud that seemed to mark the end of one story and the beginning of another. The box had a simple but effective latch mechanism on the front. It was stiff from disuse, but unlike everything else in the tower, it was not rusted. It was made of brass, and it had been protected from the corrosive, salty air. Her fingers, clumsy with cold and anticipation, fumbled with the clasp. For a moment, it resisted her, a final guardian of the secret within. Then, with a sharp, satisfying click that was impossibly loud in the roaring gale, the latch sprang open. A puff of dry, ancient air escaped, carrying a scent she had never encountered before, but recognized instantly. The smell of history. It was the arid, delicate aroma of old paper, of tanned leather and of ink, perfectly preserved from the dampness that had consumed everything else in this place. The scent was a whisper from the past, a story waiting to be told. She took a deep, shaky breath, held the flashlight steady, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of what looked like dried, oil-treated fabric, were two items. The first was a small, unassuming pouch made of thick, dark leather. It was drawn shut with a simple leather thong and was unexpectedly heavy, sagging in the center with a lumpy, dense weight. The second item took her breath away. It was a book. Its dark blue cover was warped and brittle at the edges, and the gold leaf lettering was flaked and faded, but the words were still perfectly legible under the flashlight beam. The Serafina. Beneath the name was a year, 1978. It was a ship's logbook, a story, an answer. The two objects lay there, one promising wealth, the other promising truth. For a moment she could only stare, her mind struggling to comprehend the reality of the discovery. This was not a keeper's personal effects. This was something else entirely. This was evidence. The contents of this box were the reason for the hiding place, the reason for the lead lining, the reason for the silence. Her hand, as if with a will of its own, reached for the leather pouch first. The immediate, tangible promise of it was too powerful to ignore. The leather was supple but cool to the touch. The knot in the thong was tight, swollen with age. She worked at it with her numb fingers, her heart pounding. The knot finally gave way, and she loosened the drawstring. A strange, greasy odor came from within. Taking a deep breath, she carefully tipped the pouch's contents into the palm of her other hand. They didn't sparkle or glitter like jewels in a movie. Instead, they seemed to drink the weak light from her flashlight. A small pile of milky, opaque, and vaguely crystalline stones, each about the size of a robin's egg. They felt slick, almost oily, and were shockingly heavy, uncut, raw diamonds. A fortune, not just enough to get off this rock, but enough to change their lives forever. A wild, disbelieving laugh escaped her lips, a hysterical sound snatched away by the wind. The sheer, staggering value of what she was holding was an anchor and a whirlwind at the same time. It was the end of all her problems, a magical, impossible solution delivered by a ghost. The cold, the hunger, the eviction, the crushing debt. In her hand was the power to erase it all. The diamonds were a physical manifestation of hope, so real and solid it made her dizzy. But as the initial shock subsided, a more chilling question took its place. Where did they come from? Diamonds like these weren't a lighthouse keeper's pension. This was smuggler's loot or pirate's treasure. This was dangerous money, and it was tied, inextricably, to the book that lay beside them. The diamonds were the motive, but the logbook was the story. The raw, untamed power of the stones in her hand was terrifying, a heavy secret she now bore alone in the heart of the storm. The solution to her problems had just created a new, more perilous mystery. She carefully poured the diamonds back into the pouch, tied it securely and set it aside. Her attention was now completely fixed on the logbook. This was the real prize. This was the answer to the light. This was the why. Her hands, though still trembling, moved with a librarian's practiced care as she lifted the book from the box. The cover was stiff, and it creaked in protest as she opened it. The first few pages were filled with the neat, professional script of a ship's captain, navigational coordinates, weather observations, cargo manifests, the mundane details of a vessel at sea. The ink was a faded sepia, the paper yellowed but perfectly preserved. She could smell the faint, dry scent of paper and time, a fragrance that was both comforting and deeply unsettling in this place of rot and ruin. She flipped through the pages, a chronicle of a voyage that had ended here, on these rocks, 40 years ago. She skipped toward the end of the book, her instincts telling her the story was in the final pages. The change was abrupt and shocking. The neat, orderly script devolved into a desperate, chaotic scrawl. The handwriting was jagged, slanted, the letters formed by a hand shaking with fear or urgency. Ink was smeared and blotted in several places, ghostly watermarks that could have been seawater or tears. Her flashlight beam shook as she tried to decipher the frantic words. Her blood ran cold. Sentences leaped out at her, fragments of a nightmare. May 2nd, 1978. Storm is a lie. Deliberate course for the rocks. Orders from the commander. Not cargo. They're people. Prisoners. God forgive me. The screams. The final, nearly illegible entry was a single, horrifying sentence. I am the only one who saw. The mystery of the ghost light was solved. It wasn't a signal. It was an echo. The dying scream of a ship named the Serafina, and the secret of its murder, now lay open in her hands. The storm outside was a roaring beast, but inside Ilara's mind, a new and more terrible tempest had been unleashed. The brittle pages of the logbook felt impossibly fragile in her trembling hands, a thin membrane separating the present from a 40-year-old atrocity. She read Alistair Vance's words, his frantic, spidery script, a testament to the horror he had witnessed. His terror was a palpable thing, a coldness that seeped from the yellowed paper and into her very bones, a chill far deeper than the wind whipping through the lantern room. She could almost hear it, the grinding shriek of the Serafina's hull on the rocks, a sound deliberately engineered. The keeper's words painted a scene of calculated murder, not a storm. He had written, the ink bleeding slightly, as if from a tear. The commander gave the course. He aimed the ship like a weapon. Ilara's stomach churned with a sickening mix of fear and revulsion. This tower, this rock, was not just a ruin. It was a crime scene, a monument to an unspeakable act of state-sanctioned evil, and she was its first visitor in decades. The logbook was more than a record. It was a confession by proxy, a burden of witness passed down through time. Alistair described the ship not as a freighter, but as a floating prison, its hold filled with men, women, and children deemed enemies of the former military junta. They were political prisoners, intellectuals, artists, and their families being disappeared under the cover of a routine naval exercise. Ilara felt a wave of nausea so profound she had to brace herself against the cold, damp wall. The screams Alistair described in his frantic scrawl echoed in her imagination. A ghostly chorus carried on the wind. She saw their faces, illuminated by the ship's dying lights, a moment of terror frozen in time. The scale of the cruelty was incomprehensible. This wasn't a shipwreck. It was a massacre, methodically planned and executed by a man in a crisp naval uniform, a corrupt commander whose name was seared into the pages of the log, a name that made her heart hammer with a new kind of dread, the dread of knowledge. The narrative in the logbook became even more desperate. Alistair wrote of the aftermath, of the bodies washing ashore with the morning tide, a grim harvest delivered by the sea. He wrote of his own cowardice, his paralyzing fear of the commander's immense power. He was just a keeper, a solitary man on a rock, a witness to a crime so vast it could swallow him whole without a trace. Then came the survivor. A single man, broken and battered, had washed ashore, clinging to a piece of wreckage and a small leather pouch. Ilara's eyes darted to the heavy pouch resting beside her, the raw diamonds inside suddenly feeling like stones of immense, sorrowful weight. The man, one of the prisoners, had been entrusted with what remained of the victim's seized wealth. He had gasped out the full story to Alistair, the commander's name, the purpose of the voyage, the list of names he had memorized, before succumbing to his injuries in the keeper's cottage below. The diamonds were not treasure. They were a trust, a sacred, blood-soaked inheritance. Alistair Vance, terrified but bound by the dead man's final words, had made a choice. He couldn't go to the authorities. The authorities were the murderers. The commander's reach was long, his power absolute. So he did the only thing he could. He created the secret compartment, a lead-lined tomb for the truth, hiding the logbook and the diamonds from the world, from the commander. From time itself, he became the silent guardian of the Seraphina's ghost. Elara finally understood. The heavy, lead-lined cover was not just to protect the contents from the elements, it was to stop anyone from finding them by chance, a final, desperate act of preservation. The strange flash of light she and Leo had seen was explained in a final, chilling addendum. It was a local legend, a folk tale Alistair had recorded. The Ghost Echo, sailors called it. A psychic stain left on the island, a recurring phantom of the Seraphina's final, desperate signal for a help that never came. It wasn't a key, it was the island's eternal scream. The days following the storm were shrouded in a new kind of silence. The roar of the wind had been replaced by the quiet weight of the secret Elara now carried. She told Leo only a part of the truth, that they had found something valuable left by his great-great-uncle, sparing him the horrific details. The diamonds stayed hidden in the tin box, a source of both incredible hope and suffocating fear. The logbook she kept with her, wrapped in oilcloth, its presence a constant, chilling reminder of the story it contained. They were no longer just castaways. They were guardians of a truth that could shatter powerful lives. A week after the storm, a new sound intruded upon their isolation, a sound so alien it made Elara's blood run cold. It was not the chug of a fishing boat, but the deep, confident thrum of powerful twin engines. A sleek white yacht, a vessel of obscene luxury, sliced through the water and dropped anchor a few hundred yards from the shore, its polished chrome glinting arrogantly in the pale sun. Elara's heart seized in her chest. A profound sense of dread washed over her, cold and absolute. This was not a chance visitor. This was not a lost tourist. This was an arrival. She watched as a smaller inflatable boat was lowered from the yacht, 2 men in crisp uniforms at the helm. In the center sat a third figure, a man whose posture radiated an easy, unshakable authority. She and Leo stood near the cottage, 2 ragged figures frozen against the backdrop of their ruin, as the boat expertly navigated the rocks and landed on their small, black sand beach. The man stepped out, his expensive leather shoes landing silently on the sand. He was in his late 60s, with a mane of perfectly coiffed silver hair, a handsome, tanned face, and eyes the color of ice chips. He wore a tailored navy blazer and cream-colored trousers, a vision of wealth and power so out of place on this desolate rock that he seemed like an apparition from another world. The sickeningly sweet scent of his expensive cologne reached her on the breeze, a violation of the island's raw, briny air. He walked toward them, his movements smooth and deliberate, his gaze sweeping over the ruined cottage with an expression of faint, condescending pity. His eyes, however, held a predatory glint, a sharpness that belied his relaxed demeanor. "Mrs. Vance, I presume?" His voice was a smooth, cultured baritone, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, the voice of boardroom meetings and exclusive clubs. Elara felt her throat tighten, a knot of pure fear forming in her stomach. She could only nod, her own voice deserting her. Leo stood protectively close to her, his young face a mask of defiant suspicion. The man's smile was a masterpiece of insincerity. "My name is Arthur Croft." The name hit Elara with the force of a physical blow. Croft. It was the same name from the logbook, the son of the corrupt naval commander. She felt the blood drain from her face, a cold numbness spreading through her limbs. The monster from the story was standing right in front of her, dressed in a philanthropist's skin. He hadn't come for the lighthouse. He'd come for the secret. "I am the head of Croft Shipping," he continued, his voice dripping with false modesty. "A philanthropist, a historian of sorts. I heard through Port Authority records that this old property had finally been occupied. I must say, it's in even worse shape than I imagined." His gaze flickered dismissively over the collapsing roof and shattered windows. The insult was clear, wrapped in a silken package of concern. He knew exactly what they had, and this was the opening move in a game she didn't know how to play. Elara felt a surge of cold fury beneath her terror. The audacity of the man, standing on the grave of his father's victims and feigning pity for her circumstances, was staggering. She clutched the hidden logbook through the fabric of her coat, the brittle edges of the book a sharp, grounding reality. The story wasn't a ghost anymore. It was here, breathing the same air as her, and it wanted to bury the truth forever. She felt Leo's hand grip her arm, a small, desperate signal of shared fear and defiance against this powerful intruder. Croft's eyes, cold and calculating, settled on her. "This place is a death trap, Mrs. Vance. An absolute liability. In fact, my corporation has been trying to acquire this hazardous rock for years, to have it demolished for public safety." He let out a soft, paternal sigh. "But seeing your predicament, I'm prepared to make you a personal offer, a charitable gesture, you might say." He named a sum, a figure that might have seemed like a fortune to her a month ago, but which she now knew was an insult, a pittance offered for the price of silence. It was just enough to get them off the island and disappear, to erase them from the equation. He wanted to buy the tomb of his family's crimes and sanitize it, bulldozing the lighthouse and its history into the sea. The offer hung in the air, a poisoned chalice disguised as a lifeline. Ilara's mind raced, a frantic search for the right words, the right move. Saying no was dangerous. Saying yes was a betrayal of the dead. Her silence was a palpable thing, a vacuum into which all the unspoken history of the island was being pulled. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, and his mask of benevolence slipped for a fraction of a second, a flicker of cold, hard impatience. "I understand this is a lot to take in," he said, his tone shifting, losing some of its warmth. "You're in a desperate situation. I'm offering you and your son a way out, a clean slate." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The air grew thick with unspoken threats. Ilara felt a tremor start in her hands. She knew with chilling certainty that this was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. Croft's gaze shifted from her to Leo, a slow, deliberate appraisal that made Ilara's maternal instincts scream. Her body went rigid, a primal need to shield her son rising up inside her. He was no longer just a powerful man. He was a direct physical threat to the only person she had left in the world. The diamonds, the truth, the history, all of it faded into the background, replaced by the singular, terrifying focus of protecting Leo from the cold calculation in Arthur Croft's eyes. He knew exactly where she was most vulnerable. "It is a treacherous island, isn't it?" Croft said softly, his voice a silken menace. He wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze was fixed on the slippery, seaweed-covered rocks near the water's edge. So many hazards, jagged edges, unpredictable tides. He let the sentence hang in the air, a gallery of horrifying possibilities. Then, he turned his icy gaze back to her, but his words were for Leo, a strong teenage boy, full of energy. It would be so easy for him to slip, have an accident. The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare, a cold, sharp blade pressed against her son's throat. A wave of pure, undiluted hatred, hot and fierce, surged through Ilara, momentarily burning away her fear. This man, this monster, would use the memory of his father's victims as a stepping stone and threaten her child's life to protect his family's name. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to hide, to do whatever it took to get Leo away from him. But there was nowhere to go. They were trapped on the rock with his legacy. Croft seemed to sense he had made his point. His benevolent mask slid perfectly back into place. He reached into his blazer and produced a pristine white business card. "I am a busy man, Mrs. Vance. I will be back in 1 week for your answer. I do hope, for your son's sake, you make the sensible choice." He placed the card on a flat, grimy stone, the stark white a jarring intrusion on the landscape of decay. He didn't offer to shake her hand. He simply gave a slight, dismissive nod, turned, and walked back to his boat with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never known defeat. The two uniformed men, who had stood like statues, followed him. Ilara watched them go, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. The thrum of the yacht's engines starting up was the sound of a countdown beginning. 1 week. 1 week to choose between the truth and her son's life. The secret of the Serafina was no longer a historical burden. It was a loaded gun pointed directly at her head. The yacht became a white speck on the horizon and then vanished, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more menacing than before. The business card on the stone seemed to radiate a cold malevolence. Ilara felt utterly, hopelessly trapped. The discovery of the logbook and diamonds had felt like a turning point, a shift from being a victim of fate to an agent in her own story. But now she saw the truth. She hadn't found a secret had found her, and it had dragged its monster along with it. She was a librarian, a widow, a mother. How could she possibly stand against a man like Arthur Croft, a man who could command yachts and henchmen, a man whose philanthropy was a shield for a legacy of mass murder, a man who wouldn't hesitate to harm a child to protect his name? The weight of the decision pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. Every instinct screamed to take the money and run, to disappear and keep Leo safe. But the silent screams from the logbook, the ghosts of the Serafina, cried out for justice. She looked at Leo, whose young face was a mixture of fear and a burgeoning, righteous anger. He had heard the threat. He understood the stakes. "We can't let him get away with it, Mom," he said, his voice low but firm. "We can't." Ilara's heart ached with a terrible conflict. His courage was a reflection of his father's, but it was a courage she feared would get him killed. To fight would be to step into a war against a man with an army. To flee would be to let the monster win, to dishonor the dead, to live the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. The diamonds in the hidden box were no longer a solution. They were bait. The logbook was not a shield. It was a target. She was trapped between honoring the dead and protecting the living. The ruin around her was no longer just a physical prison. It was a moral one. The choice she had to make was impossible, a razor's edge with oblivion on either side. Her breath caught in her throat, a sob of pure, desperate indecision. The sea crashed against the rocks, indifferent to her agony. The isolation that had once been her greatest fear now had a new, more sinister dimension. It was the very thing that gave Croft his power over them. There was no one to call, no police to summon, no one to hear them scream. They were alone with a monster's ultimatum. Holding the truth was a death sentence if she stayed, but surrendering it felt like a death of the soul. The raw diamonds could buy their escape, but could they buy their silence? Could they buy their safety from a man who knew they were the only living witnesses to his family's origin story? Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. This wasn't a one-time offer. It was a cleanup operation. Whether she took the money or not, she and Leo knew the truth. They were loose ends. The week he had given her wasn't a grace period. It was just the time he had allotted for her to walk to her own execution. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and impossible choices. What would you do in her place? Would you take the deal, sacrificing justice for the chance to save your child? Or would you risk everything to expose the truth, knowing the monster would return? For 2 days, Ilara existed in a state of suspended terror, the world muted and distant. Croft's pristine business card sat on the crumbling windowsill, a stark white rectangle that held more power than a loaded gun. It was a constant, screaming reminder of the countdown. Every crash of a wave sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind was a whispered threat. She would watch Leo as he practiced tying fishing knots, his brow furrowed in concentration, and a cold dread would seize her, so powerful it made her vision swim. She felt the weight of her love for him as a physical vulnerability, a soft, unprotected spot that Croft had seen and targeted with surgical precision. The man's words echoed in her mind, a relentless loop of casual menace. An accident. The phrase was a poison, seeping into every thought, turning the beautiful, treacherous landscape of the island into a catalogue of potential deaths. The rocks were no longer just rocks. They were sharpened edges designed to break a young man's bones. The sea was not just the sea. It was a cold, dark lung waiting to be filled. A fragment of memory surfaced from the fog of her fear, something she had dismissed as insignificant. On a clear afternoon before the storm, while scanning the horizon, she had seen a flicker. From a neighboring islet, a smudge of green about a mile across the churning channel, she had thought she'd seen a glint of sun on glass, or perhaps the faint, thin wisp of smoke from a campfire. At the time, she had discounted it, her world having shrunk to the immediate problems of food and shelter. Now that memory returned, blossoming from a faint impression into a desperate, razor-thin sliver of possibility. A person. Could there be someone else out here in this desolate archipelago of forgotten rocks? Not a man like Croft, arriving on a yacht of polished steel, but someone like them, a hermit, a fisherman, anyone. The thought was so fragile she was almost afraid to examine it, for fear it would disintegrate. But in the barren landscape of her options, this tiny, improbable chance was the only seed of hope that remained. It was a long shot, a prayer whispered into a hurricane, but it was better than silence. On the third day she found it. While clearing a pile of soggy debris in what was once the keeper's small workshop, her fingers brushed against something smooth and cool, buried in the grime. It was a piece of an old mirror, about the size of her hand. The silvering on the back cracked and peeling like a strange, geographic map. It was broken, but it still held a reflection. Clutching it, she felt a surge of adrenaline that was almost painful. This was their voice, their only way to shout across the mile of hostile water. She ran to Leo, her heart hammering against her ribs. "There," she said, her voice a breathless whisper as she pointed toward the distant hazy islet. "I saw a light there. Smoke. We have to try." Leo looked from the mirror to the island, his face a mixture of skepticism and desperate willingness. There was no guarantee anyone was there, or that they could even see a signal, but the alternative was to wait, to sit in this crumbling tomb until Croft returned to seal it. The simple act of doing something was a powerful antidote to the paralysis of fear that had held them captive. They spent the entire day on the highest, most exposed point of St. Jude's Rock, a windswept granite outcrop that offered a clear view across the channel. The wind was a constant, physical pressure, whipping Ilara's hair across her face and chilling them to the bone despite the pale, watery sun. They took turns holding the mirror, tilting and angling it, trying to catch the sun's rays and fling a desperate, Morse code flash of light toward the silent green smudge on the horizon. Hours passed. The sun crawled across the sky. Their arms ached, and their eyes, strained from staring, burned and watered. Hope began to curdle into frustration. The silence from the other island was immense, a vast, indifferent void that swallowed their frantic signals without a trace. Leo's shoulders began to slump. "It's no use, Mom. No one's there." His voice was flat with resignation. Ilara felt her own resolve crumbling. The gesture now felt foolish, a child's game played against an unforgiving adult world. The sea and the sky remained empty, their loneliness absolute. Just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds in hues of orange and bruised purple, a flash answered them. It was tiny, almost imperceptible, a brief pinprick of light from the shore of the other island. Ilara gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. "Leo, look!" They both stared, unblinking, hardly daring to breathe. Another flash, and another. Someone was there. Someone was answering. A wave of relief so profound it made Ilara's knees weak washed over her. They were not alone. The feeling was intoxicating, a powerful jolt of connection in their desolate world. A short time later, a dark speck detached itself from the distant shoreline. It grew slowly, resolving into the shape of a small, weather-beaten skiff, a single figure at the tiller, chugging steadily across the choppy water towards them. As it drew closer, Ilara could see it was a vessel as old and patched as their cottage, its engine coughing with a rhythmic, familiar protest. The person at the helm was a man, his form silhouetted against the setting sun. Hope, real and tangible, was crossing the water to meet them. The skiff didn't try to land on the treacherous main beach, but navigated expertly to a small, sheltered cove Ilara hadn't known existed. The man who stepped out was as weathered as his boat. He was old, perhaps in his late 70s, with a face that seemed carved from driftwood, all sharp angles and deep-set lines. A wild, unkempt beard, the color of seafoam, covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, buried in a web of wrinkles, were a startlingly bright blue, sharp and intelligent. He moved with the slow, deliberate surety of a man who had spent a lifetime on uneven ground and rocking decks. He carried no weapon, only a coiled length of rope over his shoulder. He looked at Ilara and Leo, then at the ruined cottage behind them, his expression wary, guarded, and tinged with a deep, ancient sadness. "Saw your light," he grunted, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting in the surf. "Thought this place was left to the ghosts. Name's Jacob." He did not offer a hand. He simply stood there, a sentinel of the outer islands, waiting for an explanation. Ilara's words tumbled out in a frantic, disjointed torrent. She spoke of the inheritance, the arrival, the horrifying state of the cottage. Jacob listened without interruption. his bright blue eyes never leaving her face, his expression unreadable. But when she spoke of the storm, of the impossible flash of light from the lantern room, a flicker of something, recognition, pain, crossed his face. His posture changed, the weary caution replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "The ghost echo," he whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of the waves. "It still calls." He stared up at the top of the tower, a strange reverence in his gaze. Ilara, emboldened by his reaction, made a decision. Trusting him was a gamble, another leap of faith in a life that had become full of them. But looking into his sea-blue eyes, she felt a strange certainty. She reached into her coat and pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped logbook. "It's more than a ghost, Jacob," she said, her voice trembling as she held it out to him. "It's a story, and I think you already know it." Jacob looked at the logbook in her hands, as if she were holding a venomous snake. His own hands, gnarled and calloused from a lifetime of nets and ropes, began to tremble. Slowly, reverently, he reached out and took the book. He didn't open it. He just held it, his thumb tracing the faded gold letters of the name, the Serafina. A single, harsh sob escaped his throat, a sound of grief 40 years in the making. "My father," he choked out, his voice thick with unshed tears. He was the one who washed ashore. The confession hung in the air between them, a bridge of shared history spanning decades of silence. He sank to his knees on the cold, damp sand, the logbook clutched to his chest like a sacred text. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place in Ilara's mind. Jacob, the hermit of the Outer Isles, was the son of the man who had died in Alistair Vance's arms. He was the living legacy of the massacre, the solitary guardian of a story he could never prove, until now. His body shook with the release of a lifetime of suppressed grief and disbelief. He told them his story in fits and starts, his voice raw with emotion. He had been a young man himself when he'd received a garbled message from the lighthouse keeper to come at once. He found his father, near death, delirious, ranting about a shipwreck that was no accident, about a corrupt commander and a hold full of innocent people. He spoke of a secret list of names he had memorized, a final duty to the dead. Alistair Vance, terrified, had corroborated the story, but swore Jacob to secrecy, convinced they would both be killed if the truth ever came out. After his father died, Jacob had honored his promise. The world had accepted the official story, a tragic accident in a storm. His father's dying words were dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized mind. For 40 years, Jacob had lived with the story, a poison in his heart, a truth so monstrous it had isolated him from the rest of the world, turning him into a recluse who communed only with the sea and the ghosts of the past. He looked at Ilara, his eyes swimming with tears. "I thought I was mad," he whispered, or that he was. Then, Jacob's expression hardened, the grief momentarily burned away by a grim resolve. He reached inside his own worn oilskin jacket, a mirror image of Ilara's desperate attempt to protect the logbook. His hand emerged with a small, flat packet, wrapped in the same material and bound tightly with tarred twine. His fingers, though trembling, moved with practiced familiarity as he unwound the twine. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded many times, so old and brittle it threatened to turn to dust. He carefully unfolded it. It was covered in a dense, cryptic scrawl. It looked like nonsense, a jumble of letters and numbers. "My father was a cryptographer before they took him," Jacob explained, his voice low and heavy. "He gave the code to Alistair, and Alistair gave it to me. He made me memorize the key." He pointed to a series of letters on the page. "This is not just a list. It is the definitive proof. Every name, every family, and the orders, passed down, signed by Commander Croft's own adjutant. It connects Croft's father directly to the massacre." The weight of the small, brittle paper in Jacob's hand was immense. It was the keystone. The logbook was the narrative. The diamonds were the motive. But this list was the undeniable, prosecutorial evidence. It was the weapon they needed. It transformed the story from a historical tragedy into an active crime with a living perpetrator in Arthur Croft. A cold, hard resolve settled in Ilara's heart, displacing the fear. They were no longer just victims. They were not just guardians. They were now the arbiters of a 40-year-old justice. Croft was here, she said, her voice steady and clear. He knows we have something. He threatened my son. He's coming back. Jacob's face grew grim, the lines around his eyes deepening. He nodded slowly. He's been searching his whole life. His father died disgraced, suspected but never proven. Croft built his empire to wash away that stain. This evidence wouldn't just expose a crime, it would shatter the foundation of his entire life, his identity. He looked from Ilara to Leo, his gaze full of a fierce, protective fire. He won't stop at threats, Jacob said softly. Tonight is the deadline. The air grew heavy as dusk began to fall. A familiar, ominous bank of dark clouds was gathering on the horizon, the sky turning the color of a fresh bruise. The wind began to pick up, carrying the cold scent of rain and a palpable sense of menace. It was as if the island itself was bracing for a final confrontation, the weather once again providing a dramatic backdrop for human evil. Jacob's presence was a small comfort, but Ilara's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. The 7th day, the deadline. Croft's promise echoed in her ears. She paced the small, cleared space in the cottage, the logbook and the pouch of diamonds now feeling like a physical weight strapped to her body. Leo stood by the window, his young face tense, scanning the darkening sea. The quiet thrum of Jacob's skiff, anchored in the cove, was a fragile counterpoint to the rising roar of the wind and surf. Every shadow seemed to lengthen and twist into a threatening shape. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a slow tightening of a knot in her stomach. The silence was not empty. It was full of anticipation. Then a new sound cut through the rising storm. It wasn't the chugging of Jacob's boat. It was the low, aggressive growl of powerful engines, the same sound she had heard a week ago. Her blood ran cold. She rushed to the window next to Leo. There it was, not Croft's pristine white yacht this time, but a smaller, faster, more menacing vessel. A dark grey speedboat cutting through the churning waves with brutal efficiency. It had no lights. It was a predator, built for stealth and speed. It anchored in the same spot as the yacht, a dark, jagged shape against the turbulent water. Two figures, clad in black from head to toe, dropped a small inflatable raft into the water and began paddling toward the shore, their movements swift and purposeful. They were not here to negotiate. They were not here to make an offer. They were here to take. A wave of pure, ice-cold terror washed over Ilara, but underneath it a hard, defiant anger began to burn. They would not have it. They would not erase this story. Not now. Her phone, which she'd been painstakingly charging with a small solar charger Jacob had given her, buzzed in her pocket. The screen lit up with an unknown number. Her hand shook as she answered it. Mrs. Vance. Arthur Croft's voice was no longer smooth or cultured. It was flat, cold, and devoid of any pretense. It was the voice of a man giving a final order. My associates are on the island. You will give them the tin box and its entire contents, everything. You will not speak to them. You will not resist. If you do, they have their instructions. Lighthouses are made of stone, but the cottages are old wood. They burn quite nicely, as do their occupants. Do you understand me? The line went dead. The threat was absolute. Give him the truth or he would burn them alive with it. The primitive, brutal finality of it stole her breath. She looked at Leo, whose eyes were wide with terror, then at Jacob, whose face was a grim mask of resolve. There was no escape. There was no negotiation. The time for waiting was over. The time for fighting had begun. The cistern, Jacob said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. At the base of the tower, when Alistair was still here, it was where he collected rainwater, but the pump broke decades ago. It's just a deep, dark hole now, full of stagnant water and sludge. The cover is rotten. A plan, desperate and lethal, began to form in the space between them. It was a terrible, dangerous idea, but it was the only one they had, to fight back using the island itself as a weapon, to use the decay and the ruin that had been their prison as a tool for their survival. Ilara's mind, once paralyzed by fear, was now working with a strange, all-cold clarity. She saw the layout of the cottage, the treacherous floors, the dark corners, the crumbling structure of the tower. They were not just hiding in a ruin, they knew its every weakness, every trap. Croft's men were armed and dangerous, but they were on unfamiliar ground. In the darkness, in the storm, in the place she now knew better than any other on Earth. Ilara felt a flicker of a predator's instinct. This was her territory. They moved with frantic, silent purpose. Jacob, surprisingly agile for his age, slipped out of the back of the cottage and disappeared into the howling darkness, heading for his boat. "I'll bring help," he whispered before he went. "Keep them busy." Ilara and Leo were alone. They could hear the heavy tread of boots on the gravel outside the front door. "Leo," Ilara said, her voice low and steady, gripping his shoulders. "I need you to be the diversion. Make noise in the east wing, where the roof is most unstable. Draw one of them, but be careful. Stay in the shadows. Do not let them see you." Leo, his face pale but his eyes resolute, nodded. He squeezed her hand, a fleeting, desperate touch, and then melted into the darkest corner of the cottage. Ilara clutched the precious tin box to her chest. Her target was the tower. She had to get the evidence to high ground, to a place where she had the advantage. The heavy, unhinged door to the cottage was kicked open with a loud, splintering crash. Two dark figures, their faces obscured by ski masks, filled the doorway, powerful flashlights cutting through the gloom. One of the men barked an order. "You, check the side rooms, I'll check the tower, find the box." The old man said she has a box. Just then, a loud clatter echoed from the far side of the ruined cottage, followed by the sound of scuttling feet. The first man swore and immediately charged in that direction, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. "I've got something over here," he yelled. The trap was sprung. Leo was doing his job. Ilara's heart was in her throat, but she didn't have time for fear. The second man, larger and broader than the first, turned his attention to the tower door. He was between her and her goal, thinking fast. She kicked over a pile of loose debris, rotted wood and broken glass, near the main fireplace. The noise made the second man pivot, his flashlight beam sweeping toward the sound. In that split second of distraction, Ilara, cloaked in darkness, darted from her hiding spot behind the crumbling armchair and slipped through the open doorway at the base of the lighthouse, pulling the heavy stone door almost shut behind her. She was plunged into the familiar, echoing darkness of the spiral staircase, her only light the faint ambient glow from the storm outside, filtering through the high windows. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was sure the man outside could hear it. She held her breath, listening. She heard a furious shout from the cottage, the first man, realizing he'd been tricked. Then, the heavy stone door to the tower was shoved open. The beam from the second man's flashlight sliced up the stairwell, a brilliant white cone that sent her scrambling for cover around the next curve of the staircase. "I know you're in here," the man's voice boomed, echoing unnaturally in the confined space. "The boss wants the box. He didn't say he needed you alive." His heavy footsteps began to climb the stone stairs, slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly close. It was a nightmare ascent, a slow-motion chase up the spine of the lighthouse, Ilara's silent, desperate flight versus the man's methodical, predatory pursuit. Suddenly, a choked scream echoed from the base of the tower, followed by a loud, sickening splash. The man pursuing her froze on the stairs below. "Marco!" he yelled down into the darkness. There was no answer, only the gurgling, sucking sound of water closing over something heavy. Leo and Jacob's plan had worked. The first man had doubled back, seen the tower door ajar, and in his haste had stepped right onto the rotten wooden cover of the cistern. A cold knot of horror and relief tightened in Ilara's stomach. One was down, but the man on the stairs, after a moment of shocked silence, let out a roar of pure rage. His footsteps were no longer slow and methodical. They were fast, heavy, and furious, pounding up the stone steps. He was no longer just a professional. He was enraged, coming for her with a vengeance. Ilara didn't look back. She scrambled up the remaining stairs, her lungs burning, her legs screaming. The tin box clutched to her chest like a shield. She burst into the lantern room, the full force of the storm hitting her like a physical blow. The lantern room was a cage of screaming wind and fury. Rain lashed through the broken glass, drenching her instantly. The man emerged from the stairwell behind her, a hulking silhouette against the darkness, his flashlight beam pinning her against the central lens assembly. He was massive, his chest heaving with exertion and anger. He took a step toward her, his intentions clear. There was nowhere left to run. "Bad choice," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "Now you give me the box." Ilara backed away, her feet shuffling on the slick floor. until her back was pressed against the rusted iron railing of the exterior walkway. The wind tore at her, threatening to rip her from the tower. The churning Black Sea raged 150 feet below, a vision of absolute oblivion. She held the tin box out over the railing, her knuckles white. "You take one more step," she screamed over the howl of the wind, "and I'll drop it. It'll be lost forever in the sea. You'll go back to Croft with nothing." It was a desperate, final gamble, her only remaining card to play. The man stopped. He was only 10 feet away, but the abyss between them and the box in her hand created a new kind of distance. His flashlight beam was fixed on the box, his masked face unreadable, but she could feel his indecision. His orders were to retrieve the box. His rage was telling him to kill her. The two imperatives warred within him. "Don't be stupid," he said, his voice laced with a new, wheedling tone. "Just give it to me. We can walk away. Nobody else has to get hurt." He took a small, shuffling step forward. Ilara's grip on the box tightened. The metal was slick with rain. Her hand was numb with cold. Her entire body trembled, not just from fear, but from the strain of holding the heavy box over the roaring void. "Stay back!" she shrieked, the wind stealing the words from her mouth. She could see it in his eyes, the decision being made. He wasn't going to risk the evidence. He was going to rush her, to take her and the box down together, trusting his strength against hers. His body tensed, coiling like a predator about to spring. He lunged. The movement was brutally fast, a blur of black cloth and violent intent closing the distance in an instant. Ilara screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror, her body instinctively recoiling. At that exact moment, the impossible happened again. The lantern room, the entire top of the tower, was flooded with a silent, instantaneous, and utterly blinding pulse of pure white light. The ghost echo, summoned by the storm or by the sheer intensity of the moment, blazed to life. It was 1,000 times brighter than her memory of it, an incandescent blast that turned the world into a searing white void. The man, caught in mid-lunge, cried out, his hands flying to his face as the light burned his retinas. He was completely, totally, and miraculously blinded. He stumbled forward, disoriented, his arms flailing wildly, no longer reaching for her but for something, anything, to hold on to in the sudden, shocking darkness that followed the flash. The impossible light had given her a chance. The man, blinded and raging, staggered past her. His flailing hand caught the rusted railing, but his momentum was too great. With a scream of shock and terror that was swallowed by the storm, he pitched over the side. Ilara didn't see him fall. She only heard the scream cut short, but he managed to grab the railing with one hand, his huge body dangling precariously over the abyss, his boots scrabbling for purchase against the slick stone of the tower. At the same time, shouts echoed from the stairwell. 3 figures stormed into the lantern room, clad in the bright yellow slickers of the Coast Guard. At their lead was Jacob, his face grim, a heavy wrench clutched in his hand. He had made it. He had brought help. They saw the scene in an instant. Ilara, trembling, clutching the box, the armed man dangling from the railing. As the man struggled to pull himself up, his sight slowly returning, Jacob and a guardsman lunged forward. There was a brief, violent struggle, the sounds of grunts and the dull thud of the wrench against bone, and then the man went limp, subdued. The aftermath was a blur of frenetic activity and disorienting calm. The storm still raged outside, but inside the lantern room, the immediate danger had passed. One Coast Guard officer was securing the unconscious henchman with thick plastic ties, while another was on the radio, his voice a calm, professional staccato, reporting the situation and requesting backup and medical assistance for the man in the cistern. Jacob rushed to Ilara's side. She was leaning against the central lens, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. Her knuckles were still locked in a death grip around the tin box. He gently placed a hand on her arm. "It's over, Ilara," he said, his voice soft. "It's over. You did it." The words seemed to come from a great distance. She looked from the subdued man on the floor to the open doorway of the stairwell, where Leo now stood, his face pale but unharmed. He ran to her, and she dropped the box with a loud clatter, wrapping her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder, the adrenaline finally giving way to a tidal wave of shuddering relief. The Coast Guard commander, A woman with a calm, authoritative presence approached Ilara. "Ma'am," she said, her eyes gesturing toward the tin box now resting on the floor. "Jacob told us a wild story. He said you have evidence. Evidence of a crime." Ilara, still clinging to Leo, could only nod. She knelt down, her movements stiff and clumsy, and opened the box. She presented the logbook and the small, heavy pouch of diamonds. Then Jacob stepped forward, unfolding the brittle, coded list of names. He handed it to the commander. She took the 3 pieces of evidence, her expression shifting from professional skepticism to shock as she examined the logbook's frantic final entries and the cryptic list of names. She looked from the evidence to Ilara, then to Jacob. "The Serafina," the commander breathed, a note of disbelief in her voice. "I thought that was just a story, a closed case." Jacob shook his head, his eyes burning with a 40-year-old fire. "The case was never closed," he said, his voice ringing with grim certainty. "It was buried, and tonight we dug it up." The journey back to the mainland was surreal. Ilara, Leo, and Jacob were wrapped in thick, warm blankets in the cabin of the Coast Guard cutter, the powerful vessel slicing through the subsiding storm with an ease that felt miraculous. The 2 captured henchmen were secured in the stern, silent and defeated. The tin box, now an official piece of evidence, sat on the table in the center of the cabin, a quiet testament to the night's events. Ilara watched the lights of the distant town grow brighter, her mind struggling to process the violent, chaotic whirlwind of the last few hours. She had faced death. She had been an accomplice to a man's fall. She had fought for a truth that wasn't hers. She ran a hand through her damp, matted hair and felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, but it was overlaid with something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The quiet, steady glow of victory. They had survived, not just the island and the poverty, but the monster. They had faced Arthur Croft's legacy of violence and had won. The lighthouse, their prison, had become their fortress and their weapon. As the cutter pulled into the harbor, the flashing blue and red lights of waiting police cars and federal vehicles painted the docks in a chaotic, strobing display. It was an overwhelming reception, a stark contrast to their silent, anonymous arrival, what felt like a lifetime ago. A group of stern-faced officials in dark suits was waiting for them. Ilara, holding Leo's hand tightly, felt a fresh wave of anxiety. The battle on the island was over, but the war in the world of laws and power was just beginning. She clutched the evidence which the commander had returned to her for the official handover. Would they be believed? Was a 40-year-old logbook and the testimony of a castaway, a hermit, and a bankrupt librarian enough to topple an empire built on lies? She looked at Jacob, whose face was illuminated by the flashing lights. He looked old and tired, but his eyes held a steady, unwavering flame. He had waited his entire adult life for this moment. They walked down the gangplank together, stepping from the isolation of their rock into the center of a storm of their own making. One of the officials, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes who introduced herself as a federal prosecutor, led them to a quiet room in the Port Authority building. The air was warm and dry, a shocking contrast to the damp cold that had been their constant companion. People brought them hot coffee that scalded their throats and sandwiches that tasted like the most delicious food they had ever eaten. The prosecutor listened with rapt attention as Ilara, Jacob, and finally Leo recounted their stories. Ilara's voice was hoarse but steady as she described finding the logbook. Jacob's was thick with emotion as he explained the coded list. Leo, with a newfound confidence, detailed Croft's threat and the events of the final night. The prosecutor recorded everything, her expression growing grimmer with each revelation. She handled the logbook and the list with a reverence that reassured Ilara. This was not being dismissed. The gears of a great and powerful machine were beginning to turn, grinding slowly but inexorably in the direction of justice. In the early hours of the morning, a young federal agent entered the room. He addressed the prosecutor, but his words were for everyone. "We have him," he said, his voice crisp. Arthur Croft was apprehended at a private airfield, attempting to board a flight to a non-extradition country. He didn't resist. A collective, shaky breath of relief filled the room. Ilara felt the last knot of tension in her shoulders finally release. He was caught. The monster was in a cage. She looked at Jacob and saw tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks, carving clean paths through the grime. They were not tears of sorrow, but of vindication. 40 years of silence, of being the sole keeper of an impossible truth, had come to an end. The ghosts of the Serafina, the silent chorus that had haunted the lighthouse and his life, could finally begin to rest. Ilara reached across the table and placed her hand on his. They were strangers, bound by a shipwreck and a secret, and together they had brought down a king. The lighthouse had not been an inheritance of property, but of purpose. The story of the Serafina broke not like a wave, but like a dam. It flooded the national news cycle, a torrent of 40-year-old secrets washing away the carefully constructed narratives of the post-junta era. Arthur Croft's handsome, philanthropic face was plastered across every screen. His expression of shock a pathetic mask against the damning evidence. His name, once synonymous with corporate success and charity, was now irrevocably linked to the junta's darkest chapter. In a sterile government safe-house, the air thick with the scent of strong coffee and ozone from humming photocopiers, Ilara watched the empire of lies crumble. The low, authoritative drone of a news anchor replaced the sound of the howling wind. Each new detail revealed, the henchman's confessions, the corroborating evidence from the military archives, was a nail in the coffin of Croft's legacy. She felt a strange detachment, as if watching a historical drama, until she saw a photo of the Serafina. It was then her heart ached with the true weight of it all. The legal proceedings moved with a speed fueled by decades of suppressed outrage. The surviving henchman, his partner's gurgling end in the cistern, a powerful motivator, gave a full confession that painted a chilling portrait of Croft's obsessive, lifelong search for the evidence. The coded list, deciphered by federal cryptographers in a matter of hours, was a bombshell. It contained not only the names of the murdered passengers, but also coded communiques detailing the orders given by Commander Croft. In a quiet, soundproofed room, Ilara gave her official deposition. Her voice, though exhausted, was steady. She recounted every detail, from the eviction notice to the ghost light, the words flowing with the clarity of truth. Beside her, Jacob's testimony was the emotional core, a son's grief finally given voice, a story once dismissed as delirium now being entered into the official record of a nation's crimes. The quiet scratch of the stenographer's pen was the only sound, the sound of history being corrected line by line. A committee from the National Human Rights Commission met with her and Jacob in a sunlit corner office overlooking the city. A kind-eyed woman explained the legal complexities. The diamonds, tainted by their origin, could not simply be handed over. They were a national artifact of a tragedy. However, she continued, the state recognized the extraordinary circumstances, the personal risk, and the profound service they had rendered to the country. In recognition of this, a finder's reward, a legal mechanism for just such an unprecedented event, had been approved. The woman slid a folder across the polished table. Inside, a certified check was made out to Ilara Vance. The number had so many zeros Ilara's vision blurred. It was more money than she could comprehend, a figure that felt as fantastical as the ghost light itself. She felt a wave of dizziness, not from hunger this time, but from the sheer crushing weight of security. The 280 she had clutched in her car felt like a relic from another person's miserable life. This was not just a reward, it was a resurrection. Arthur Croft's fall was as spectacular as his rise. The trial became a national spectacle, a public exorcism of the country's ghosts. His carefully cultivated image of a benevolent patriarch shattered, revealing the desperate, ruthless man beneath. Other families, whose loved ones had vanished during the junta's reign, came forward. Their old wounds reopened, but their voices finally heard. The case of the Serafina became a catalyst for a new wave of investigations. News channels played clips of Croft, not in a tailored suit at a charity gala, but in a drab prison jumpsuit, his face ashen, his eyes hollowed out by defeat. The Croft shipping empire, built on a foundation of blood and silence, imploded under the weight of scandal and federal seizures. His father's name was officially struck from the naval honor rolls. Arthur Croft was not just sentenced to life in prison. He was sentenced to become a footnote in the story of the victims he had tried so hard to erase. His name a permanent synonym for infamy, the final, pathetic victim of his own family's crimes. With a fortune in the bank and the world open to her, Ilara made a choice that surprised everyone but herself. She bought a sturdy, reliable boat, christened the Witness, and hired a crew. She loaded it not with boxes of new luxuries, but with architectural plans, tools, and supplies. Then, she set a course back to St. Jude's Rock. As the island emerged from the mist, it looked different. The tower no longer seemed like a skeleton or a tombstone. It stood tall and defiant, a silent partner in her struggle. She could feel its history not as a burden, but as a deep, resonant part of her own story. The wind that whipped her hair felt clean, not malevolent. The cry of the gulls sounded like a welcome, not a mournful dirge. Leo stood beside her at the railing, his face turned to the wind, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. They were not returning to a prison or a ruin. They were going home, not to the place of their despair, but to the site of their unlikely and hard-won salvation. This time, they were arriving as its saviors. The sounds of rebirth soon filled the air around the lighthouse. The rhythmic thud of hammers, the high-pitched whine of power saws, and the cheerful shouts of a construction crew replaced the oppressive silence and the howl of the storm. The ruined keeper's cottage was not just patched, but reborn. The collapsed roof was cleared away, and a new one, framed with strong, fresh-smelling cedar, took its place. Complete with a large skylight that flooded the interior with light, the stench of mold and decay was banished, replaced by the clean, sharp scents of sawdust, paint, and salty air blowing through new, gleaming window panes. Ilara walked through the framed-out rooms, her hand trailing along a smooth, new wall. She was not just overseeing a renovation, she was participating in a healing. Every new plank, every pane of glass, felt like a stitch closing a wound, both in the cottage and in her own soul. The structure that had been their tomb was slowly, deliberately, being transformed into a sanctuary, a testament to resilience built of stone and wood. One evening, months later, Ilara sat alone in the finished cottage. A warm fire crackled merrily in a newly built stone fireplace, its light dancing on the polished wood floors and the spines of books that now lined the walls. It was a library again. Her library. The air was warm, filled with the scent of wood smoke and old paper, a perfume of profound comfort. She had managed to save one box of Daniel's most treasured books from their old life, and she now pulled one from the shelf. It was a collection of maritime poetry. Her fingers, no longer raw or trembling, traced the familiar cover. The silence was no longer a suffocating void of fear. It was a peaceful, expansive quiet, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, gentle sigh of a calm sea. It was the silence of safety, the silence of a future that was no longer a terrifying black hole, but a blank page, waiting for her to write on it. A single, silent tear traced a path down her cheek, but this time, it was not a tear of grief or despair. It was a tear of quiet, overwhelming gratitude. The long, handcrafted dining table, made from reclaimed wood, was laden with food. A golden brown roasted chicken sat in the center, surrounded by bowls of steamed vegetables, fresh baked bread, and a deep red wine that caught the firelight. The scene was a universe away from the stale granola bar they had shared in the dark. Jacob, his wild beard now neatly trimmed, was telling a story about catching a legendary fish in his youth, his bright blue eyes twinkling with mirth. Leo, seated across from him, was laughing, a full, uninhibited sound that Ilara hadn't heard in years. His face was no longer pale and haunted, but tanned and relaxed. He was home. Ilara watched them from the head of the table, a glass of wine in her hand, her heart swelling with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. This was her family now, this strange and beautiful trio forged in a storm. She felt Daniel's presence, not as a painful ghost, but as a gentle, approving warmth at her back. This, she knew, was a happiness he would have wanted for them. This was redemption. The transformation was made official 6 months later. In a small, dignified ceremony on the island, a government minister declared St. Jude's Rock and its lighthouse a national memorial to the victims of the Serafina and a monument to the enduring power of truth. The lighthouse itself was fully restored to its former glory, its magnificent Fresnel lens polished and gleaming. Its light was a powerful, automated LED beacon, a guide for modern ships, but its soul was ancient. Ilara and Leo were appointed its official, salaried custodians, a role she accepted with solemn pride. She was a keeper of the light in every sense. The final piece of the restoration was her idea. Once a year, on the anniversary of the shipwreck, the brilliant white light is extinguished for 1 minute. It is then replaced by a single, focused beam of blue light that shines out towards the open sea for 3 silent seconds, no longer a ghost echo of despair, but a deliberate, annual salute to the lost souls, a promise from the island itself that they would never be forgotten. Ilara stood on the newly constructed lantern room walkway, the iron railing cool and solid beneath her hands. The sun was a fiery globe melting into a calm, violet sea, a gentle breeze, a lover's whisper compared to the storm's scream, ruffled her hair. She looked down at the cottage, a warm golden light spilling from its windows, a beacon of home. She could hear the faint sound of Leo's guitar, a soft, melodic tune drifting up to meet her. She was no longer a victim, no longer a castaway. She was the guardian of a story, the keeper of a sacred place, a woman who had journeyed through the deepest darkness and had not only found the light, but had chosen to stay with it. She had found her harbor. Ilara's journey from absolute despair to becoming a beacon of justice shows that even in the darkest storms, a single light can change everything. What did you think of her final choice to stay? If you believe in the power of stories of resilience and redemption, make sure you are subscribed and have enabled all notifications, so you never miss another incredible story from our channel.